Today, as I mentioned earlier, I want to talk a little bit about that really thorny issue of practicing what we preach, or in another way of saying it, practicing what we truly believe. Because, especially in the world that we're living in now, there really is no place for hypocrisy. I mean, there never was, but hypocrisy kills so much good work or good thoughts that we may have had, and so it's so important that it not creep into our lives. And as Phil read from the Gospel of John, about a story of a woman caught in adultery, which was punishable by death by stoning. And it literally was, you would throw stones at the individual until they died. So bones would be broken, joints would be dislocated, incredibly painful, brutal way of dying. And that's what the law said. But Jesus always said, that's the minimum standard. That's not the maximum. There's a place for grace. And so that's when he said, let that person who has no sin cast the first stone. And of course, at that point, they all had to walk away. I want to just briefly share another passage from the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, which was written by the Apostle Luke. Talks about what happened after Jesus died, when he was no longer with them, and it was the apostles that were carrying out the building of this new Christian church. So I want to read very briefly from Acts 15, 36 to 40, and this tells a little story that we don't hear very often about the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Barnabas. Now, if you tell me you've never heard of Barnabas, I will not be the least bit surprised. I hadn't heard of Barnabas either until just, a dozen years or so ago, and I have great respect for Barnabas. So, these words of Scripture. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Come, let us return and visit the believers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take with them John, who was called Mark. But Paul decided not to take with them one who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not accompanied them in the work. The disagreement became so sharp that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and set out, the believers commending him to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So here's an example. Paul and Barnabas were both disciples. And they were disciples, they were not chosen by Jesus, but they were disciples that had come to believe and work for Jesus after the fact. Now, we hear a lot about Paul. He's got a lot of letters, we quote him. We don't hear a whole lot about Barnabas. And you see, Barnabas and Paul were working together, and Barnabas wanted to take Mark with them on this missionary journey. Paul said, no, we're not taking him because he didn't really measure up the last time, and I'm not giving him a second chance. Barnabas said, no, we need to give that second chance to him. Like, Barnabas was the fellow of second chances. And that disagreement became so heated that Paul and Barnabas parted company, and we never hear about Barnabas again. It would have been so much easier for Barnabas, and I might add, a much better career move, if he had just not stood up for his principles. but he was a person of second chances. And he believed that everybody deserved a second chance. So he said to Paul, "No, I'm not going unless we take Mark." And they parted company. So Barnabas really put a lot on the line for what he believed. And we don't hear about him again because the winners always write the histories. That's the way it goes, but it's changing now. So I think that we've got two stories, and I've got these two stories purposely because I want them to kind of frame the discussion we have about practicing what we believe, or sometimes people frame it, taking Sunday's faith into Monday's workplace. And I believe that that's probably the hardest calling that anybody accepts. When I was struggling with a call to ministry back in my 20s, which was, oh gosh, that must have been at least 20 years ago, I really felt that what God was calling me to do was to be a really committed layperson and to take my faith into the workplace and kind of witness in the workplace. And I wasn't very good at that. And the more I struggled and prayed, I realized that God was calling me into the ministry. But I thought that going into the ministry was a real cop-out, because I knew that in the ministry, I would be able to talk freely about faith, not just able to, but people expect me to, because that's what I do. And what a gift. What a gift to take time during the week to study Scripture and to think about how I might frame a reflection that we can all get something out of. What an incredible gift. So I've always had tremendous respect for lay people, for yourselves, because you're the backbone. You're everything that happens in a church. The minister is just kind of the one that does a little tweaking and getting this one to go this way and helping. When I was first ordained, I was sent up to Wawa. It was kind of far away. I didn't have any colleagues, and I really didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I knew that there was a Sunday service, and you went to visit people in the hospital and so forth, but I'd never kind of lived the life of a minister. And I remember coming to a continuing education event that first winter. Part of it was the continuing education event. Part of it was the opportunity just to get away and reconnect with friends. And unbeknownst to me, I bumped into a gentleman who was my first supervisor when I was at Queen's. Our very first placement, first year, Ted Colwell, Reverend Ted Colwell. And Ted was a very kind of steady, calm, nothing seemed ever to flap him. And so I saw him there, unbeknownst to me, and in his typical calm way, he said, "Oh, Kathy, how are things going?" Well, here I was, just yikes. So I gave him a very quick and animated discussion about, sort of, help me. And I remember he said, "Now, Kathy, tell me," he said, "how are your lay people? Do you have some good lay people?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I've got great lay people." And then he said, "Well," he said, "never underestimate your lay people. They will teach you everything you need to know." And to this day, after all these years, I can tell you that that was absolutely correct and the best advice I ever got. Because the lay people in every church I've ever served have taught me what I needed to know at that time to serve in that place. They figured out what I couldn't figure out as a 20-something, how to take Sunday's faith into Monday's workplace. That's what Jesus was talking about, and that's what Barnabas sacrificed his own career for, was to stand behind the principles of what they believe. Phil mentioned earlier that kindness is the overriding principle here. And a young university student said to me, it always kind of rattles me when, sort of new on campus, it always kind of rattles me when, you've got, the mean girls. We've all had the mean girls in our life, right? And the meanest girls of all, and then you see their Facebook page, and it's quoting a scripture message. And I said, yeah, I have trouble with that too. Because if we're quoting scripture, and we're saying that we're believers, that we believe in kindness, that we believe in the golden rule, we believe in what Jesus taught us, then there's no place for meanness to anybody, for any reason. It just does not make any sense. So, in both of these passages, but particularly the scripture passage, we see what is most important. It's not a big deal. It's not difficult. When I was in my 20s, I thought everything was so difficult. As I get older and older and older, I realize that life is actually pretty simple. We don't have to do anything particularly except model. Our behavior has to model the love that we believe Jesus has for us. If we were the ones that were in the middle of that circle for whatever, how would we feel? How would we be? And better yet, if we were in the circle of people standing around that person who had been caught in whatever sin, how would we respond to Jesus? That person wronged me. I'm going to get my revenge. Or as Maxine, Maxine in the comic says, don't go to bed angry. Stay up all night and plan your revenge. So I'm going to get my revenge because that person wronged me. No. I'm going to heal from whatever and continue to model the kind of love that Jesus came and showed and died for. Barnabas sacrificed his career. Jesus sacrificed his life to tell us that the most important thing is that we model the love and we model what happens when we live out that difference. So, I'm going to skip that page. Oh, dear. Skip that page. We don't need that. I'll just cut that out. When Jesus was confronted by people, and most of the stories that we hear of his, it's this kind of, sort of a black and white. Here she is, she sinned. And it's very clear in the Torah and the law that this is unacceptable behavior. She sinned. Okay, come on. Jesus doesn't get into an argument. He doesn't try to engage. He just says, okay, that's fine. So the first one of you that hasn't sinned, you start the stoning. Okay, so that means if I accuse somebody else, I got to look at myself, right? The old story, if I've got one finger pointing at you, I've got three pointing back at myself. So if I say, well, you've done this, I better look at three things that I've done. That's not very comfortable, is it? So we'd rather not do that. Jesus did this all the time. And it's almost like he's talking a different language, but on parallel tracks. People came to him. Remember the story of people coming to Jesus with so Jesus, who do we pay our taxes to? Do we pay them to Caesar? We pay them to God? Who do we pay these taxes to? And what does Jesus say? Whose face is on the coin? Okay, so pay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and pay to God what belongs to God. In other words, we live in a world where we have responsibilities. So we look after those responsibilities, and then we look after our responsibilities as a people of God. Or the one I like the best is, remember that wonderful passage comes up every year at Good Friday where Jesus is brought into to Pilate's office. And Pilate is he's a petty bureaucrat stuck in a backwater. I mean, Palestine was that was, in the Roman Empire, it was a nothing. He wanted to move out of there, and Pilate saying, people bring him in. So he's saying he's king of the Jews. And Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, well, it's you that say that I am. Oh, so you are the king of the Jews. My kingdom is not of this world. So we have this constant sort of two tracks where Jesus is speaking the truth in love, but people are so busy with their preformed ideas they can't hear him. And so we get this sort of two people going down parallel tracks, the language of the world, the language of the kingdom. And we're called to live out the language of the kingdom by our actions, by what we do, by what we say, by what we leave unsaid. And that's sometimes the harder thing, by what we leave unsaid. And so when you think about it, here I thought as a 20-something that it was so difficult, I had to do this and this, but really what it involves is every day in all our interactions, we model the love and the acceptance and the inclusivity that we claim we believe. So it means that walking down the street, I live downtown, there's a lot of people panhandling and stuff, and so I have a choice. I can ignore them, I can engage with them, or I can be rude to them. Well, I don't need to be rude. I can engage in a friendly way, or I can ignore them. But I don't need to challenge and carry on, because if I do, then I'm like those mean girls that my young university friend talked to me about. And so if I truly believe in what I come on Sundays to remind myself of, then that's what I model. And I say it's easy. Sometimes the easiest things are the things that elude us the most, right? At its very heart, it's very straightforward. And sometimes the most straightforward things are the most difficult. Oh heavens, I think I better wind up. So, in our time now, I think what's important is that we simply do what Jesus did. He talked the language of spirituality. He didn't talk religiosity. That's what the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zionites did. He talked the language of the Spirit, which goes right to a person's heart. Engage them at that level. And that's what we need to do. And one of the things I think we need to do as churches is to start offering opportunities for people to gather to worship at times other than Sunday morning. I was bumped into a dear friend on the elevator yesterday, or Friday, I guess it was. She's a very committed Catholic, and she was on her way up to Mass at St. Peter's. And she said, it's great. She said, there's almost as many people there as there would be for a Sunday Mass. And I said, well, I think you've come to something that the rest of us need to start doing, is to offer opportunities to worship other than Sunday morning. And offer those opportunities for people to be able to check in. Just check in. One of the most valuable things when we're here, especially during the time of the sermon, I mean, you may have checked out long ago from what I'm saying, but if you're sitting and wondering about the complexities of the world, even if you're making your shopping list, I don't care, because you're here and you're taking the time, the discipline to stop in this busy world and wonder about what is life about. And that's the most valuable thing we can do to equip us to be the people that God needs us to be. So may it be.